Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So if you're going to continue to stay, so let's get started by first logging onto Azure with your live ID and creating a machine learning workspace. So if everyone's kind of done that, we can go ahead and get started creating our first experiment. So the product supports different ways to do both ingress and egress. Ingress, we support data from various different data sources, which includes a local hard disk. So you can basically then, and we'll do this in a few moments, but if you have data sources on your local hard drive, you can kind of pull them into your Azure ML Studio and then start working on it from there. An HTTP, so if you give it an HTTP URL to a data source, it will actually go ahead and utilize the data from there. That's great if, for example, you basically you want to have one source of truth, for example, of data, or it's kind of a data set that is kind of, you just kind of want to keep that separate. Azure storage, so if your data exists, for example, in a blob or table storage within Azure, we can also work with that. The other thing, too, is if it's in SQL Server, Hadoop, or Microsoft Power Query. So we can utilize a number of those different sources for data for our experiments. And similarly, when we're actually running our experiments, we can also write back to different locations as well. Again, that includes local hard disk, Azure Blob storage or table storage, SQL Server, or Hadoop. So the first thing that we'll do is actually upload a data set to the workspace. And a lot of the data that we'll be working with comes from a variety of machine learning classes. So this one happens to be from the Irvine campus, and it's their zoo data set. But, and I should, do you know what we didn't do? You know what, I'm just going to pause here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a URL to a zip file. And that zip file contains both the data. It contains the PDF versions of all of the slide decks that have all of the steps. But there's one document in there. It's a PDF file that actually has all of the links, and it has R script in it. That what we'll do is it makes it a little bit easier to click on that rather than typing in the URL. And certainly you don't want to be typing in all the R script either, so you can do a kind of a cut and paste. So let me just back off real quick and give you that. Sorry. It's this last. Okay. Yeah. So it's this last URL here at the bottom. So if you were to go ahead and just type that in, it's to a zip file. And if you download that zip file, it contains what I had just described there.
Files got sort of 1 to 9 PDFs in it.
Yes. Yeah, and there's a full. Right, and you'll see one document in there that's called the Azure ML Workshop Data Source References. And what you want to do is open that up and just kind of keep that maybe cached on your desktop or something like that, because it has all of the links that we'll be using, so you don't have to type them in. You can just click on them. It also has, like I said, the R script in there, so we'll cut and paste and utilize that a little bit later. Okay, you guys got that? Let me just show that. Okay. So what we'll do is I'm going to switch back and forth. What I can show you is I can show you how we do it, and then if you like to follow along, this one's fairly straightforward. And what we're going to do is grab that data set. It's called zoo.data, and if you click on that URL in your methods of data ingress and egress, you should have access to it. Just save it somewhere on your local hard drive, and then what we'll do is we'll upload it together. So let me go ahead and switch over. Okay. So this is the workspace that I had created earlier, Cambridge 44. And I'm going to go ahead and sign into the ML Studio. I've already kind of downloaded it off the internet. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to Experiments here, select New, Data Set from your local file. It's fairly straightforward. And browse to the location where I had stored it. Let's see, sorry. And wish I, there we go. So my zoo.data. I might give it a friendly name. And it has a kind of a description here. You can go ahead and select, for example, the type of data set it is. I know that this particular one is a CSV file with no header. So we'll go ahead and click that and hit the check mark. And then in the background, what you'll do is you'll get some status down here on the bottom that describes the progress of uploading that data set. It should go fairly quickly. And right now, so one of the things that we put into the product early on in the early previews was actually another pane here that actually had studio, home, experiments, and data sets. So you could actually see the list of data sets that you're working with in the system. Unfortunately, that page went away. They're bringing it back. I pointed out because it's kind of funky the way that you have to kind of find the data that you uploaded. So you have to kind of go in and create kind of a new experiment to see it. So if you do new experiment, you'll basically see a palette right here of menus. And these are all basically the actions that we can perform within the system. So you have saved data sets, and if I was to expand that, you'd see a whole bunch of data sets. A lot of these data sets are data sets that support the samples. And unfortunately, right now, there's no way to kind of filter them out to see which ones that you've uploaded. So the ones that you've uploaded will actually be mixed in here. So if I search down a little bit, zoo data, that's the one that I had just uploaded. And we're going to touch on each one of these throughout the day. The second one is basically data format conversions. So converting various formats to ARFF, CSV, a data set, and so on. Next we're going to do a data input and output. So this is a reader and a writer. We call these things modules. We have a number of various data transformation services as well. Filtering, manipulation, sampling and splitting, and scaling and reducing. Feature selection. Machine learning that support basically initializing, evaluation, scoring, and training the models. We have R language support, and we'll do something about that later. Statistical functions and some test analytics. And again, a lot of these functions, especially the models and statistical packages, actually come from either research or Bing or Xbox, or they're the best of breed ones that we've found externally. So while we have this experiment page open, let's now exercise how to read data from Azure Blob Storage. So I went ahead and I have Azure Blob Storage an account set up. And So for that, what we're going to do is utilize what's called a reader. So let's go ahead and first let's name this experiment. So if I go up here, we can call this Blob reader. That's the name of the experiment. And in the data input output, there's two modules. One's a reader and one's a writer. This sounds pretty obvious what they do. If I drag the reader over, so really what I'm doing is I'm clicking on reader and just dragging and dropping. Now I have that on my canvas. And if you take a look over here on the left-hand side, you see a number of different ways that different data sources that we can read from. One is Azure Blob Storage, HTTP, SQL Azure, a table, a Hive query, or Power Query. So we're going to basically read data from an Azure Blob Storage. Obviously, in order for the system to connect to that blob storage where that data lives, we have to provide it with authentication information. So we're going to authenticate via an account name. There's two different ways, public or account. The account name, if you go back to this sheet that you downloaded, this handy dandy one, you'll see in here the also the reading and the writing. So let's just do this. So we're going to select public because I didn't put any credentials for this time. For this blob storage, I made it public accessible. So it's public, and I need to grab the URL from it. So let's just do this. Let me bring up that sheet of paper real quick so you guys can follow along. There it is. So it's this URL right here, the second one. So what I'm going to do is just copy that. And what I'm doing is that there's a data set called adultcensusdata.csv. And what I'm doing actually is I'm going to reference that and read it into my Azure ML workspace. So I'm going to paste that here, that URL. And then from a file format, I'm going to leave it as CSV because I know that file format's CSV. And I'm going to check this because I know that, for example, that data does have a header row. Everyone follow? Now, once I've configured this, what I want to do is select Run. And when I select Run, what's happening is that the Azure ML is posting this this job more or less on a service, on a queue. And you see in the upper right-hand corner it was queued. Now it's running, and you get an indication that it's running next to the reader. And when it's done running, it will say finished running, and you'll get the check mark. If there's any errors, you would basically kind of see like a red bang or something like that next to it. So now what we can do is just kind of visualize it to kind of make sure that we actually got it. So if I go here and I click on the results, so these are all modules, and sometimes they take inputs, and sometimes they also produce outputs. This particular module just produces an output. The input is really configured through the properties window on the side. And later on, we'll take a look at some modules that have both inputs and outputs. So this one, I could actually take a look at the results data set and visualize it. So if I go here and click on this, I can download it. I could save it as a data set, a training set, save it as a trained model, and we'll talk about all these a little bit later. Also visualize it. So if I click visualize, the product produces this really nice summarization of the data. And this comes in handy, especially when you're starting to think about your strategy on how to clean and transform the data to get it in a position where you actually can do some machine learning on it. And we'll kind of review some of these things fairly quickly throughout the day. But for example, here, the results data set, I can take a look. These are the column names, age, work class, education, occupation. I can scan across those. The product automatically generates a mean, median, min, max. and so on and so forth. So I can take a look and scan this data to kind of at least say, hey, how does this look? Do I see any anomalies that I need to go ahead and correct? It also indicates, for example, if there's any missing values, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But here, for example, in word class, it detected that there were 1,836 missing values, and that might be an indicator that I need to do something with those missing values a little bit later on. And I can quickly scan through the data. So that's an example of how to read data from a blob storage. And then the next thing what we'll do is actually read data from an HTTP source. So this is the case where you don't necessarily own the data, but the data might live somewhere like at an NGO, which is very common, or some institution that produces, for example, data and makes it available for the public. Then instead of copying it locally and kind of bringing it to the system, I can just reference it via a URL and leave it there. So what we'll do is create a new experiment. So select New, Experiment. And what we'll do is we'll call this an HTTP reader. Right? That makes sense because that's what we're going to do is we're going to access this from the web. Again, we expand the data input and output window here, drag and drop the reader, and then we want to go ahead and configure this. So again, we want to specify our data source, and in this case, it's HTTP. We want to provide it with the URI, and if I go back to my cheat sheet here, I don't see it. Yeah, we'll grab this one. We'll just use the same one, the zoo data one, on the top, because it's referenced over at the Irvine campus in California. And what I'll do is I'll cut and paste this here. And I know it's CSV format, and I also know that it does not have a header row. And I'll go ahead and run that. And what it's doing now is the service is going out and fetching that directly from that URI and kind of pulling it into the system. And that should work. And you can always kind of validate that it worked. Number one, not only do you get the checkbox, but also visualizing the data as well. And in that case, there it is. And you can see in this case, it created column names, but there were no column names, so it arbitrarily just put something 1 through N. Okay, so I think we've covered read pretty well. Let's do a writer. So suppose maybe you're working with an experiment and you want to basically write and persist the information, or rather the output, to somewhere. Let's call it maybe blob storage or a Hive table or something like that. So this is where the writer module comes in handy. And what we're going to do is, let me just save this off. What we'll do is we'll create a new experiment. And let's call this one Blob Writer. So this time what we're going to do is we're just going to grab a data set that exists here already today. And let's use this one here. This is a iris information. I can go ahead and visualize this. So this is an iris data set. So information about flowers. And so this was already, it probably supports one of the samples that are in the product today. Okay, and then the next thing I'm going to do, let's do something different. So this time, let's convert it to a CSV file. So I know, I just happen to know that this Iris2 class data is in ARFF format. And really what I want to do potentially is work with it in a CSV format. So what I want to show you here is a data format converter. And I'm going to convert it to CSV, connect the two. So really what I'm doing is I'm connecting the output of the data into the input of, in this example, the convert to CSV module. And then let's go ahead and run it. And it's finished. And what I could do is visualize it. And because it's CSV, I just happen to have Excel. I double-clicked on it, and it's just going to show it up in Excel. And you can see that it's actually taking the R format and actually converted it to a CSV format with row headers. R format doesn't typically have row headers. Okay. So we've done a little bit of conversion, and really kind of what I'm trying to expose all of you to is really functionality of the product, more so on how to do data science. It's really just kind of, so some of these scenarios are a little bit arbitrary. Later in the afternoon, we'll actually build a classification model, which gets a little bit more into the modeling aspect or the experimentation aspect of the product. Again, these are just more of the fundamentals. So now let's go ahead and write this CSV file to blob storage. And let me just do one thing here. Let me bring up Visual Studio. And I'm going to connect up to my Azure Blob storage from Visual Studio. So let me do that real quick. Just give me 1 minute here while I log in. Refreshing. Okay. So I created this storage account called Azure ML Workshop. If you noticed when you were doing the reading exercises, it was pulling CSV files from there. It's just a blob storage account that I created to support this class. So on the left-hand side, I've created the Azure ML Workshop and a container called data. And that's where that CSV file exists that you had moved in earlier. I also created another container called Blob sample, and that's where we're going to write this file to. So in a few minutes. So we're going to configure the studio to take that Iris data, convert it into CSV, and then write that CSV file directly to blob storage. So what I want, the reason why I'm opening it up here is because of the exercise yesterday. As you can see, people uploaded all this data. So let me go ahead and just clean out that blob storage real quick. Let me just delete all these real quick. So these are all blobs that people had written in the workshop yesterday. Okay. So it's clean now. So let's go back. And what we should see is when we're done with this exercise, we should see our work show up in this blob storage container. So we have this. The next thing we want to do is drag what's called a writer. So we're going to drag that and drop that there. And we'll connect the output of the convert to CSV to the input of the writer. And I'm going to write to Azure Blob Storage, which is that account. In this case, it is a secure blob storage, as opposed to earlier it was a public. So you have to provide credentials. And what you're going to do is enter in the account name, account key, and the path to the blob. So, and I'll show you how to get this information from Azure if you want to do it in the future. But for now, let's go ahead and open up that handy dandy sheet here. And you'll see, for example, the account name is Azure ML Workshop. So I'm just going to do that and copy that. And paste that here. And then the account key, I'm going to open this up here. And the account key is a very large key that gets generated automatically by Azure. And it's good to it's a good practice to change that every once in a while. So I'm going to cut and paste that here. And then the path to the blob storage, if you remember, it's blob sample is the name of the container. And think of a container in blob parlance to almost like a folder in the folder in a folder structure. So in your file system, basically, you have containers which are basically folders. So think of a blob as kind of a folder. So what I'm going to do is here's the path, blob sample. And I'm going to go here and do that. But I'm going to put in some, because we had a large class yesterday, just give it your initials and some random number so that you wouldn't collide when you're writing it up to the blob storage. I know that the format is CSV, and I know it also, and I know that it also has a blob header row. So let me go ahead and run this, and hopefully it should work. Nope, got an error. What I've been finding lately is that a lot of times the error is a result of me cutting and pasting it incorrectly, the information here. And sometimes I put get a space in there or something. Yeah, see that? Yeah. Try again. There we go. Yeah, so you just have to be careful with the cut and spacing. Yeah.
Run the experiment. How does it affect your bill?
So when you run the experiment, how does it affect your bill? You mean each module?
You run it a couple of times. Some experiments may last for hours, and how do you charge it?
Yeah. So the user experience actually is a little bit misleading. So really, for example, when I added the two-class data and the convert to CSV and I hit run, what it does, and then I added the next one, it caches basically the result. So what I mean is that the convert to CSV, because I ran it previously and I didn't change it, it doesn't actually rerun again from a compute perspective. Unfortunately, the UI shows that it is, but it's not really. So what it really tries to do is as long as you're not changing things up above, it's not recomputing each time. All right, I'm going to get this thing working here real quick. And I think I have a space here. Yeah, see that? Yeah, I just have to be careful when I'm cutting and pasting here. There you go. So if I go back over here and do a refresh, I should see it, and somebody else did it too. So that's now writing back to the blob. So let me just show you real quick on how you get that information, that account information, if you want to do that within Azure. If you go into your Azure Portal here, this is my Azure account. You'll see on the left-hand side all the various services that are available in Azure. And if I click on, for example, storage here, I'll see that storage account, that Azure ML Workshop. All I have to do is click on it and select Manage Access Keys. And there's the information. So the storage account information that I entered in the Properties window on the right-hand side came from there. And then the primary and secondary key, you only need one of those. You don't need both. But again, it's kind of good practice from an operational perspective to change it, every once in a while. It's just good password practice.
Primary and secondary access equal.
Yeah, they'll basically provide you access to the site. Yeah, or rather to the storage account. All right. Well, thank you very much for staying here, and it's actually nice to do this with a small group. Let me just go back to the slides real quick. We won't go through all of them, but we'll kind of, so in those handouts that you downloaded in that zip file, it has all of these slides in them. And as you can see, there's all step-by-step things to do. So if there's something that you see, or if you have to leave or something like that, you can open this up and do the experiments on your own free time. So we caught up, we did the write to the Azure Blob storage. And again, these are the parameters, an example of the parameters that for this particular experiment that we completed. This is how you get Azure Blob storage account information. We won't go through these last two here, but this is how you would read data from Azure SQL. It's the same. You get the gist, right? It's the same kind of process. You pull a reader over, and then basically on the top, you're specifying that you want to read from SQL Azure. And then you're giving it credential information. And this time, in this instance, you're giving it SQL credentials, right? So your database server name, the physical database name, the user account, and then the password. And then you can also give it a database query. So instead of, for example, selecting a whole table, you can be very specific about the data that you want to get from the SQL database. And then lastly, is very similar. If you want to do it from Hadoop, you can do that as well. In this case, this is a Hive query. So you're selecting, again, Hive as your data source. You're giving it a query. And again, some more credential information so that Azure ML knows how to connect up to that data source and then pull in the data. So pretty straightforward. I mean, these are the fundamentals, and we're going to kind of build upon this as we continue on with the workshop. Now we got the data. So then next step what we'll do is we'll start, transforming data. Okay.